The morning sun had barely risen over Chicago's skyline when Dr. Sarah Bennett's phone rang at 6:30 a.m. She was enjoying her first sip of coffee, one of the rare days she had started late. The emergency room nurse's voice was urgent. "Dr. Bennett, we need you immediately. 10-year-old boy with severe head trauma from a fall." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys and medical bag, not bothering to change from her casual clothes. Dark blue jeans and a simple gray sweater. There wasn't time. Every minute could make the difference between life and death for the young patient. She jumped into her Toyota Camry, her mind already planning the possible surgery scenarios. The hospital was usually 15 minutes away, but at this early hour, she might make it in 10. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the responsibility she carried. She had performed hundreds of brain surgeries, but each one was equally important. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars sharing the road. Sarah carefully checked each intersection, knowing she needed to hurry but couldn't risk an accident. As she approached the intersection of 5th and Main, the light turned yellow. She made a split-second decision and accelerated through, knowing the boy needed her. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Sarah's stomach dropped as she pulled over, watching precious minutes tick away on her car's digital clock. Officer Mike Reynolds approached her car, his face stern. "License and registration, ma'am." "Officer, I'm a surgeon at Chicago Memorial. There's a 10-year-old boy waiting for emergency surgery." "Please, I need to get there," Sarah explained, her voice calm but urgent as she handed over her documents. Officer Reynolds looked at her casual clothes, then back at her face. His expression didn't change. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "The yellow light, I assume. But officer, there's a child's life at stake." "Anyone can claim they're a doctor," he said, his tone dismissive. "You ran a yellow light that was turning red. That's dangerous and against the law." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay professional. "I understand, but I really am a surgeon. Here's my hospital ID." She reached for her bag. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Officer Reynolds said sharply. Sarah slowly placed her hands back on the steering wheel, feeling frustration build inside her. She watched as the officer walked back to his patrol car with her license, each minute feeling like an hour. When he returned, he handed her a ticket. "That'll be $300 for running a yellow light, and I'm adding another $100 for reckless driving." "Reckless driving?" Sarah couldn't hide her shock. "I was being careful. Officer, please, you can call a hospital to verify who I am. That boy needs surgery." "If you want to contest the ticket, you can appear in court," he said, pointing to the court date printed on the ticket. 2 weeks from today, 9 a.m., and ma'am," he added with a hint of sarcasm, "drive safely on your way to your emergency surgery." Sarah watched him walk away, her hands trembling slightly as she held the ticket. The clock now showed 7:05 a.m. She had lost 20 precious minutes. Her phone buzzed again. It was the hospital. "Dr. Bennett, where are you?" "The patient is prepped and waiting." "I'm on my way," she said, starting her car. "Tell Dr. Rodriguez to begin the preliminary procedures. I'll be there in 5 minutes." As she carefully drove the remaining distance to the hospital, Sarah thought about what had just happened. It wasn't the first time she'd faced such treatment, and she doubted it would be the last. But right now, she had more important things to focus on, saving a young boy's life. She pulled into her reserved parking spot at Chicago Memorial, grabbed her bag, and ran toward the entrance. The security guard recognized her immediately, nodding respectfully as she passed. Inside, nurses and residents moved aside as she rushed to the surgical floor, her mind already shifting fully to the task ahead. The ticket sat in her car, forgotten for now, but in 2 weeks, she would have to face another challenge in the courtroom. For now, though, there was a young life waiting to be saved, and that was all that mattered to Dr. Sarah Bennett. 2 weeks had passed since the traffic incident, and Dr. Sarah Bennett stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her surgical scrubs. She had 3 scheduled surgeries that morning, but the second one had to be delayed because of her court appearance at 9 a.m. "Dr. Bennett, the first patient is ready," her assistant texted. Sarah quickly performed a complex spinal surgery, her hands steady and sure as they had always been. As she finished, the clock showed 8:30 a.m. She had exactly 30 minutes to reach the courthouse. The hospital hallways were busy as usual. Nurses and fellow doctors nodded respectfully as she passed. One of her residents, Dr. Chen stopped her. "Dr. Bennett, I heard about your court appearance. Would you like me to come as a witness? I can confirm you were needed for emergency surgery that morning." Sarah smiled but shook her head. "Thank you, but I'll handle this. Please monitor Mr. Johnson in room 305. I should be back for the afternoon surgery." The courthouse was an old, imposing building in downtown Chicago. Sarah rushed up the stone steps, her surgical scrubs drawing curious looks from people in business suits. She hadn't had time to change. Her next patient was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. Inside courtroom 3, Sarah sat quietly on the wooden bench, watching as Judge William Harrison handled case after case. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and stern blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She noticed how he dealt with each case quickly and strictly. "Next case, Sarah Bennett, traffic violation," the court clerk announced. Sarah stood and walked to the podium. Judge Harrison looked up from his papers, his eyebrows raising slightly at her surgical scrubs. "Miss Bennett, you're here for running a yellow light and reckless driving. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied respectfully. "I'm a neurosurgeon at Chicago Memorial. That morning, I was responding to an emergency case, a 10-year-old boy with severe head trauma." Judge Harrison peered at her over his glasses. "And you thought that gave you the right to endanger others on the road?" "No, Your Honor. I was driving carefully. The light had just turned yellow, and there was a child's life at stake." The judge's expression hardened. "Miss Bennett, this court sees many creative excuses. Your choice of attire seems rather casual for a court appearance." Sarah stood straighter. "I apologize for the scrubs, Your Honor. I performed surgery this morning and have another patient waiting. I can provide hospital records to verify everything I'm saying." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She knew it had to be the hospital. They wouldn't call unless it was urgent. Judge Harrison noticed. "Is there something more important than these proceedings, Ms. Bennett?" "Your Honor, I apologize, but it might be an emergency from the hospital. May I check my phone?" "You may not," Judge Harrison said firmly. "This kind of disrespect for the court will not be tolerated. I'm doubling your fine to $800 for your casual attitude toward the law and this court." Sarah felt her heart race, but kept her voice steady. "Your Honor, I understand the court deserves respect, but I took an oath to save lives. Right now, there could be a patient who needs immediate surgery. One more word, Ms. Bennett, and I'll hold you in contempt," Judge Harrison warned. "This court has seen every excuse in the book, your story about being a surgeon." Before he could finish, the court clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, hurried to the bench with a paper in her hand. She whispered something to Judge Harrison, whose expression slowly changed as he read the note. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, she pulled it out just enough to see the message. "Emergency, 6-year-old car crash victim, brain trauma, or prepped." She looked up at Judge Harrison, who was now staring at her with a completely different expression. The note in his hand was a printout of her hospital profile, head of neurosurgery at Chicago Memorial, pioneer of several pediatric brain surgery techniques, and one of the most respected surgeons in the country. The courtroom had fallen silent, waiting for what would happen next. Sarah knew that somewhere in the hospital, a young life was hanging in the balance, while here in the courtroom, justice itself seemed to be on trial. The silence in courtroom 3 was broken by another buzz from Sarah's phone. She could feel the weight of Judge Harrison's stare as he held the paper about her credentials, but her mind was already with the injured child waiting at the hospital. Dr. Chen's text flashed on her screen. 6-year-old Emily Parker. Car crash victim. Severe head trauma. Parents already signed consent, or team standing by. Sarah looked up at Judge Harrison, her voice calm but urgent. "Your Honor, there's a 6-year-old girl with severe head trauma waiting for surgery. Every minute we delay could affect her chances of survival." The judge's face showed conflict. He looked again at the paper in his hand, then at Sarah's surgical scrubs, which now carried a deeper meaning. "Miss Bennett, regardless of your profession, this court demands." Sarah's phone rang, cutting through his words. The courtroom fell silent again. Even the bailiff seemed unsure what to do. "Answer it," Judge Harrison said finally, his voice less stern than before. Sarah quickly picked up. The entire courtroom could hear Dr. Rodriguez's voice through the speaker. Dr. Bennett, Emily's condition is worsening. Her intracranial pressure is rising. We need you here now. I'm in court, Mark. Start the preliminary procedures. I'll be there as soon as possible. Sarah's hands were steady as she ended the call, just as they would be in surgery. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. Dr. Bennett, are you saying this child will die without your specific intervention? Yes, Your Honor. I pioneered a technique for pediatric brain trauma cases. It's Emily's best chance of survival. Sarah stood straight, her voice professional but carrying the weight of urgency. I respect this court, but right now, there's a family in our waiting room praying for their daughter's life. The court clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped forward again. Your Honor, if I may, my nephew had brain surgery last year at Chicago Memorial. Dr. Bennett is known for taking the cases other surgeons won't touch. Judge Harrison's stern facade cracked slightly. The surgery, is it really that urgent? In brain trauma cases, especially with children, every minute counts. The longer we wait, the higher the risk of permanent damage or death. Sarah checked her phone again, another message about Emily's dropping vital signs. The courtroom had become absolutely silent. Everyone was watching the judge, waiting for his decision. Even the other people waiting for their cases seemed to be holding their breath. A memory flashed through Sarah's mind. Her first pediatric patient, another car crash victim. She had saved that child's life with just minutes to spare. Emily deserved the same chance. Your Honor, Sarah said quietly, I took an oath to save lives. If something happens to Emily because I'm standing here instead of in that operating room, I'll pay any fine you impose, but I'll never forgive myself for not being there. Judge Harrison looked at his own watch, then at the papers in front of him. The next few seconds felt like hours to Sarah. Her phone buzzed again. Dr. Chen sending Emily's latest vital signs. They weren't good. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke. Dr. Bennett, this court cannot ignore. He was interrupted by a commotion at the courtroom doors. A man in a security guard uniform from Chicago Memorial rushed in, ignoring the bailiff's attempt to stop him. Dr. Bennett, he called out, slightly out of breath. The Parkers are asking for you. Emily's condition is critical. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. The entire courtroom jumped. Sarah held her breath, her hand already on her medical bag. She thought about Emily, pictured the surgical procedure she would need to perform, the precise movements that could save the child's life. Judge Harrison looked at the security guard, then at Sarah in her surgical scrubs, and finally at the hospital profile still in his hand. The next words he would say would either allow Sarah to save a life or force her to watch precious minutes tick away in this courtroom. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the judge's next words, knowing that somewhere across town, a little girl's life hung in the balance. Judge Harrison's expression changed as he read through the hospital profile for the third time. His eyes moved from the paper to Dr. Sarah Bennett, who stood before him in surgical scrubs, her phone buzzing yet again with updates about little Emily. Dr. Sarah Bennett, he read aloud, his voice different now. Head of neurosurgery at Chicago Memorial. Pioneer of the Bennett method for pediatric brain trauma. His voice trailed off as he continued reading. The court clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped forward again. Your Honor, Dr. Bennett is the same surgeon who operated on your grandson last year. The judge's face paled. Sarah watched as recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. His grandson, Tommy, had been brought to Chicago Memorial with a rare brain condition that other hospitals had deemed inoperable. Sarah remembered that case well. A complicated 12-hour surgery that had saved the boy's life. You. Judge Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. You were Tommy's surgeon? Yes, Your Honor. Sarah replied softly. He had a rare arteriovenous malformation. He came to us after 3 other hospitals had turned him away. He's doing well now, I hope. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. He just started playing baseball this spring. Another urgent message lit up Sarah's phone screen. Dr. Chen's update was brief but alarming. Emily's pupils uneven. Time critical. The security guard who had burst in earlier spoke up. Dr. Bennett, your team says they can't wait much longer. Judge Harrison looked around his courtroom. The usual stern atmosphere had transformed into something else. A place where life and death hung in the balance. where justice needed to mean more than just following rules. Dr. Bennett, he said, his voice now carrying a hint of shame, when Tommy needed surgery, we waited for hours because you were in another emergency operation. They told us no other surgeon would do, that it had to be you. Sarah nodded, remembering that day. Every child deserves our best effort, Your Honor. Just like Tommy did, just like Emily does now. The judge picked up his gavel, then set it down again without using it. When they brought Tommy in, were you in the middle of something else? I was at my daughter's piano recital, Sarah replied quietly. But when a child's life is at stake, everything else has to wait. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Harrison stood up from his bench. He walked down to where Sarah stood, still holding the hospital profile in his hand. The bailiff moved forward uncertainly, but the judge waved him back. Dr. Bennett, he said, now standing face to face with her, 6 months ago, I attended my grandson's birthday party. I watched him run and play with his friends. I listened to him laugh, but until this moment, I never knew the face of the person who made that possible. Sarah's phone buzzed again. The judge glanced at it, then at the clock on the wall. Your Honor, the security guard interrupted. Emily's parents are asking if. He stopped as Judge Harrison held up his hand. The judge turned to address the courtroom. Earlier today, I accused Dr. Bennett of showing disrespect for this court by appearing in surgical scrubs. I suggested she was making excuses. He paused, looking down at his own judicial robes. But while I stand here in the clothing of justice, she stands here in the clothing of mercy. He turned back to Sarah. 6 months ago, you gave my family a miracle, and now another family is waiting for their miracle. He extended his hand, offering back her driver's license and registration. This case is dismissed. Go save that little girl, Dr. Bennett. Sarah took the documents with steady hands, her mind already shifting to the surgery ahead. As she turned to leave, Judge Harrison spoke one more time, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. And Dr. Bennett, thank you. For my grandson. Without another word, Sarah hurried from the courtroom, the security guard leading the way. Behind her, she could hear Judge Harrison calling the next case, but his voice sounded different now, humbled, changed. After Dr. Bennett left the courtroom, Judge William Harrison found it difficult to focus on the remaining cases. His mind kept drifting to the morning's events and to memories of his grandson Tommy. During the lunch break, he sat alone in his chambers, holding a framed photo from Tommy's recent birthday party. In it, the boy was swinging a baseball bat, his face full of joy. A scene that would have been impossible without Dr. Bennett's skilled hands. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the court clerk, carrying a thick file. Your Honor, I thought you might want to see this, she said, placing the file on his desk. It's Dr. Bennett's complete profile from Chicago Memorial's public records. Judge Harrison opened the file and began reading. The more he read, the more his hands trembled. Dr. Sarah Bennett had performed over 1,000 successful surgeries. She had developed new techniques that were now taught in medical schools across the country. There were letters from grateful parents, medical awards, and research papers. Did you know, Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, that she runs a free clinic every Saturday. My sister's child was treated there last month. The judge leaned back in his chair, remembering how he had treated Dr. Bennett just hours ago. He had seen her surgical scrubs and made assumptions. He had heard her urgent plea about a dying child and responded with threats of contempt. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter with a new photo of Tommy at baseball practice. The boy was running, something doctors had once said might never happen again. Cancel my afternoon appointments, he told Mrs. Rodriguez. I need to visit someone. 30 minutes later, Judge Harrison walked through the doors at Chicago Memorial Hospital. At the reception desk, he asked about Emily, the young car crash victim. The receptionist smiled. Dr. Bennett is still in surgery with her, Your Honor. She's been in there for 3 hours now. He sat in the waiting room, watching families come and go. A young couple sat nearby. Emily's parents, he guessed, from their worried expressions. The mother was crying softly while the father held her hand. Time passed slowly. Hospital staff hurried through the corridors, some giving him curious looks. A judge in his robes sitting in a hospital waiting room was an unusual sight. Finally, after what seemed like forever, Dr. Bennett emerged from the surgery wing. She looked tired but satisfied. The young couple rushed to her. "Emily is stable," she told them with a gentle smile. "The surgery was successful. She's in recovery now." Judge Harrison watched as the parents hugged each other, crying with relief. It was the same scene that had played out in this very hospital 6 months ago when Dr. Bennett had saved Tommy. As the parents followed a nurse to the recovery room, Dr. Bennett noticed Judge Harrison. She walked over, still in her surgical gown. "Your Honor," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right? Is Tommy okay?" "Tommy is perfect," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Bennett, I came here to apologize. Today in court, I saw your clothes instead of your character. I heard your occupation but didn't listen to your calling." Sarah sat down beside him, her exhaustion showing. "Your Honor, bias isn't always obvious. Sometimes it hides in our quick judgments and assumptions. When I saw you in those scrubs," he continued, "I thought you were disrespecting my court. Instead, you were honoring your oath as a doctor." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The same oath that saved my grandson's life." A nurse interrupted them with some papers for Dr. Bennett to sign. As she did, Judge Harrison noticed her steady hands, the same hands that had saved both Tommy and now little Emily. "Dr. Bennett," he said as she finished signing, "would you consider speaking at our next judicial conference? I think my colleagues need to hear your story." Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Only if you'll share your part of it too, Your Honor. Change happens when we're all honest about our journey." The judge nodded, understanding that this day marked not just a turning point for him, but a chance to make a real difference in his courthouse and beyond. The next morning, Judge William Harrison arrived at his office earlier than usual. The events of the previous day had kept him awake most of the night, causing him to examine not just his recent actions, but his entire career on the bench. He started his morning by pulling out 30 random case files from the past year. As he reviewed each one, he began noticing patterns in his rulings that made him increasingly uncomfortable. His secretary, Linda, watched with concern as he spent hours making detailed notes. "Cancel today's cases," he finally told her around noon, "and please ask Mrs. Rodriguez to join me in my chambers." When the court clerk arrived, she found the judge surrounded by open files spread across his desk. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he began, his voice heavy, "how long have you worked in this courthouse?" 23 years, Your Honor," she replied, standing near the door. "And in those 23 years, why didn't anyone, including you, ever point out these patterns to me?" He gestured at the files before him. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped closer, looking at his notes. "Your Honor, it's not easy to tell a judge they might be biased, even when that bias is clearly documented in their own rulings." He held up one of his notepads. "I've been reviewing traffic violations from the past year. Did you know that I imposed higher fines on women drivers 68% of the time? And when those women were minorities, the percentage jumped to 82%. Mrs. Rodriguez remained silent, but her expression showed she wasn't surprised by these numbers. Judge Harrison stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city below. "Yesterday, I almost let my prejudices prevent a child from receiving life-saving surgery. Dr. Bennett showed me something about myself that I can't unsee." He turned back to Mrs. Rodriguez. "I need your help. I want to review every case I've handled in the past 5 years. Every single one." "That's thousands of cases, Your Honor," she said, but she was already reaching for some of the files. "Yes, it is, and each one represents a person who came to this court seeking justice." He sat back down at his desk. "I also want to set up a meeting with the Chief Justice. The entire courthouse needs bias training, starting with me." As they worked through the afternoon, more patterns emerged. Judge Harrison made notes about cases he needed to review and possibly recommend for appeal. His hands shook slightly as he documented his findings, but his determination never wavered. Around 5 o'clock, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his daughter, with another photo of Tommy at baseball practice. The boy was smiling broadly, holding up a trophy. "First home run," the message read. Judge Harrison showed the photo to Mrs. Rodriguez. "Yesterday, Dr. Bennett asked me if Tommy was doing well. She remembered him, out of thousands of patients she's treated. She saw him as a person, not just a case number." "And now you're doing the same with your cases," Mrs. Rodriguez observed. "Yes," he nodded, picking up another file. Every person who walks into this courtroom deserves to be seen as a human being, not just another case number, not just another stereotype. As evening approached, Linda brought in coffee for both of them. She found them surrounded by even more files, with post-it notes and papers everywhere. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, "you have dinner with the Bar Association tonight. Should I cancel it?" Judge Harrison looked at his watch, then at the work before him. "No," he said firmly. "I'll go. In fact, I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about what happened yesterday. It's time we had an honest conversation about bias in our legal system." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. Dr. Bennett would be proud. "This isn't about pride," he replied, standing up to put on his coat. "It's about justice. Real justice." He paused at the door. "And tomorrow we continue with these files. Every single one of them." As he left his chambers that evening, Judge Harrison felt both exhausted and energized. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but for the first time in his career, he felt he was truly serving justice. Over the next few weeks, the Chicago County Courthouse saw more changes than it had in the past 20 years. Judge William Harrison's office became the center of a quiet revolution in the justice system. One Monday morning, the courthouse staff arrived to find notices posted throughout the building announcing mandatory bias training sessions. Some judges grumbled, but Harrison's reputation and seniority meant few dared to complain openly. "The first session starts in 30 minutes, he announced during the morning staff meeting. "And yes, I'll be attending every single one of them, just like everyone else." The training room was packed. Judge Harrison sat in the front row, taking notes like a first-year law student. The trainer, Dr. Marcus Chen, a specialist in unconscious bias, began his presentation. "Can anyone share a personal experience with bias?" Dr. Chen asked the room. The silence was uncomfortable until Judge Harrison stood up. "I can," he said, his voice clear and strong. 3 weeks ago, I almost let my prejudices prevent a surgeon from saving a child's life." You could have heard a pin drop in the room as he shared the story of Dr. Bennett. When he finished, other judges began sharing their own experiences. In his office later that day, Harrison reviewed more case files with Mrs. Rodriguez. They had already identified over 200 cases that needed review, and the list was growing. "Your Honor," Linda interrupted, bringing in the afternoon mail. "There's a letter from Chicago Memorial." The letter was from Dr. Bennett. She had successfully completed 3 more emergency surgeries since their last meeting, including one on a young girl who had been in a similar accident to Tommy's. "She's agreed to speak at next month's judicial conference," Mrs. Rodriguez said, reading over his shoulder. "Good," Harrison nodded. "But we're not waiting until then to make changes." He picked up his phone and called the Chief Justice. "James, I need your approval for something. I want to implement a new review system for all traffic violations and minor offenses. Every fine, every sentence needs to be checked for bias before it's finalized." There was resistance at first, but Harrison was persistent. By the end of the week, new procedures were in place. Every judge's decisions would be reviewed monthly for patterns of bias. The changes weren't just on paper. Harrison started spending his lunch breaks in the courthouse waiting room, talking to people waiting for their cases to be heard. He learned their stories, understood their circumstances. One afternoon, he spotted a young woman in surgical scrubs, rushing to pay a parking ticket. "Take your time," he told the clerk handling her case. "She might be needed for an emergency." The woman gave him a grateful smile as she hurried back to her hospital. The local law schools heard about the changes. Soon, they were sending observers to study what they called the Harrison Reform. Other courthouses began calling, asking for advice on implementing similar programs. Mrs. Rodriguez kept track of the statistics. Within 3 weeks, the disparity in fines between different groups had dropped significantly. Cases were taking longer to process, but the decisions were fairer. "Your Honor," she said one evening, showing him the latest numbers, "look at this. The appeal rate has dropped by 40% since we started the new review system." Harrison nodded, but his mind was on a photo he received that morning. It was from Emily's parents, the little girl Dr. Bennett had saved. She was sitting up in her hospital bed, smiling and holding a teddy bear. "It's not just about numbers," he said, showing Mrs. Rodriguez the photo. "It's about people. Every person who walks through those courthouse doors deserves to be seen as an individual, not a stereotype. As he prepared to leave that evening, he looked at two photos on his desk, one of Tommy playing baseball, and now this new one of Emily. They were reminders of what could happen when prejudice was allowed to interfere with justice. "Your next appointment is here," Linda announced. It was another judge from a nearby county, coming to learn about implementing the new bias review system. Harrison smiled, ready to share his story once again. The change that had started with a traffic ticket and a surgeon in scrubs was spreading, one courthouse at a time. 6 months after the day Dr. Bennett rushed from his courtroom to save Emily's life, Judge William Harrison stood at the podium of the National Judicial Conference in Chicago. The grand ballroom was packed with judges, lawyers, and legal professionals from across the country. "Before I introduce our main speaker," he began, adjusting his glasses, "I want to share a story about a traffic ticket that changed not just my life, but our entire judicial system." In the front row, Dr. Sarah Bennett sat in her professional attire, a far cry from the surgical scrubs she'd worn in his courtroom that day. Next to her sat Emily, now fully recovered, and Tommy, Harrison's grandson, both children healthy and active thanks to her skilled hands. 6 months ago, I saw a woman in surgical scrubs standing in my courtroom, Harrison continued. I saw what I wanted to see, someone disrespecting the court. I didn't see Dr. Sarah Bennett, one of the country's leading neurosurgeons. I didn't see the woman who had saved my own grandson's life months earlier. The room was silent as he shared the complete story. He told them about the emergency call, about Emily waiting for surgery, about his moment of revelation, and about the changes that followed. "Since that day, our courthouse has reviewed over 3,000 past cases," he said, holding up a thick report. "We found bias in 28% of them. Each of those cases represented a person who didn't receive the full justice they deserved." Mrs. Rodriguez, sitting in the audience, nodded encouragingly. She had helped compile those statistics. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Harrison continued. "Emily, would you please stand up?" The young girl stood, smiling shyly as the audience applauded. "Emily is alive today because we caught our mistake in time. But how many others have we failed because of our unchecked biases?" He paused, letting the question sink in. Today, 47 courthouses across the country have adopted what they call the Bennett Protocol, a system of checks and balances to identify and correct bias in judicial decisions. Dr. Bennett watched as Harrison explained the protocol she had helped develop, a comprehensive system that included regular case reviews, bias training, and community engagement programs. "And now," Harrison said, smiling, "it is my honor to introduce Dr. Sarah Bennett, not just as a brilliant surgeon, but as the catalyst for change in our justice system." As Dr. Bennett took the podium, the applause was thunderous. She carried with her not just her medical expertise, but the wisdom gained from years of breaking barriers. "Justice, like medicine, requires both skill and humanity," she began. "In the operating room, I don't see race, gender, or social status. I see a life that needs saving. Shouldn't our courtrooms be the same?" The conference lasted 3 days, but its impact would last much longer. Judges from across the country signed up to implement the Bennett Protocol in their courthouses. News organizations picked up the story, spreading the message of change even further. After the conference, Harrison found himself back in his courtroom, looking at the day's cases. The first one was another traffic violation, a young man rushing to his child's school after an emergency call. "Your Honor," the young father began, but Harrison raised his hand gently. "Tell me about your child first," he said kindly. "Then we'll discuss the ticket." In her office at Chicago Memorial, Dr. Bennett was preparing for another surgery when she received a text from Judge Harrison. It was a photo of his courthouse's latest statistics, showing the lowest bias rate in the state. "Thank you for teaching an old judge new tricks," the message read. She smiled, thinking about how a simple traffic ticket had sparked such change. On her desk sat an invitation to speak at next month's medical conference about bias in healthcare. The revolution was spreading to her field, too. Outside her window, the city of Chicago continued its busy pace. In courtrooms and operating rooms across the country, people like Harrison and Bennett were working to ensure that everyone, regardless of appearance or circumstances, received the justice and care they deserved. The traffic ticket that had brought them together was now framed in Harrison's office, a reminder that justice, like healing, begins with seeing the humanity in everyone who stands before us.